Dear Professor Doná, dear virtual guests, colleagues, and students, good afternoon. A very warm welcome to all of you to our inaugural lecture of the seminar series on forced migration. Before introducing our guest speaker, Giorgia Doná, please allow me to say a couple of words about the seminar series and the research platform the seminar series is also anchored in. The seminar series, the seminars are initiated by the Europe-Asia Research platform, which is taking place at the, right now, they are held at the University of Vienna Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology, but the Europe-Asia Research Platform is a collaboration between IWM, Institute for Human Sciences, Vienna, and Calcutta Research Group based in Calcutta. So the Europe Research Platform is a collaborative, and it aims cooperation between European and South Asian institutions and academics while working towards setting up a joint research agenda and a platform for innovative knowledge production on forced migration and border regimes. Bringing together, we aim to, within this research platform, we aim to bring together scholars, policymakers, practitioners from different disciplines, but most importantly, from different regions also. And the platform aspires to decenter the Europe-focused scholarship, debates, and policies on forced migration. This research platform, which is anchored between IWM and then the Calcutta Research Group, and collaborates now within the seminar series with the University of Vienna Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology, but also it benefits from and collaborates with some other initiatives, and particularly from the Cities and Human Mobility Collaborative at the Solberg Institute on Migration and Mobility at the New School for Social Research, as well as the research platform Challenge of Urban Features at the University of Vienna. Before I introduce our speaker, Giorgia Doná, please allow me to say a couple of words about the housekeeping rules. Unfortunately, we had to change our platform, the link. So some of you might not, some of the people who were registered might not have received it because we had quite a overwhelming number of registrations. I hope that they will be still able to join us, but because of the number of participants that we will only be able to take your questions through the chat function. So please use the chat function, and please keep in mind that we might not be able to take every question to pose to Giorgia Doná, and I hope that you will have an understanding for this. So let me introduce very briefly our speaker, Giorgia Doná. Giorgia Doná is a professor of forced migration and refugee studies and co-director of the Center for Migration, Refugees and Belonging and fellow of the Higher Education Academy. For more than 3 decades, she has worked as a researcher, practitioner and activist with displaced populations and refugees in Central and North America, Eastern Africa, and Europe. Her research focuses on conflict and displacement, child and youth migration, psychosocial perspectives in forced migration, refugee voices and representation, and multimodal narratives. Her recent, I'm not going to enumerate number of the very long list of publications in terms of articles and chapters, but I will just refer to the most recent publications, which include a book, The Marginalized in Genocide Narratives, Revisiting Genocide Narratives and Reconciliation Initiatives, published in 2019, which focuses on the marginalized narratives, as the title indicates, to create connections among multiple social actors and identify narrative themes that address the unequal power and interdependence of narratives. She is also a co-editor of the book entitled Forced Migration, Current Issues and Debates with Alice Bloch. And here I would like to also add to her academic work that Giorgia Doná's work had repercussions beyond academia, and it has informed the government of Rwanda national policy on orphans and other vulnerable children in 2003, as well as the development training materials for UN protection officers and NGO staff. This became the impact case study for the 2015 Sociology Research Excellence Framework, improving the welfare of children in Rwanda, Bangladesh, and around the world. She also facilitated, I would like to underline this, an exhibition, Digital Storytelling, an education exhibition as part of Living Refugee Archive. She has held positions at the Oxford University's Refugee Studies Program, the Child Studies Unit of University College Cork, Ireland, and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. As you can imagine also that Giorgia has worked with various organizations such as UNICEF and IOM and has consulted governments and non-governmental organizations. When we were thinking of launching this series on forced migration, actually the very first person, given this, you could understand why we wanted to start with Giorgia Doná as our first speaker, given, as you have heard, the scope and the spread of her expertise in terms of in academia, in different areas and different geographical locations. So thank you very much, Giorgia Doná, for having accepted our invitation, and welcome, and the floor is yours for your talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Isa, for the very nice introduction. And I want to take this opportunity also to thank the University of Vienna and the Europe-Asia Network for inviting me to be the speaker at this seminar series. And before I start, I also want to thank Anna and all those who work behind the scenes, and welcome you all. From my part, the audience that I can't see, but hopefully I will see at some point. So again, as I'm just now going to try and share my screen so that you can see my presentation. So, and again, before I start, can I ask if you can see my screen? You can, okay, excellent. So again, what I'm trying to do, what I've been trying to do for a number of years, is to think of forced migration and its relationship to borders and technologies. And with a colleague, Marie Gaudin, we have developed this concept of Techno-Borderscapes that I like to explore and understand together with you and introduce for you today. So before I start, in a way, discussing the concept Techno-Borderscapes that we have introduced, I want to give all of you a bit of an overview around the relationships between migration, borders, and technologies. So let me start with migration then. We have seen in the last 30 years what has been called the digital turn in migration studies, which has been summarized with the phrase from connecting migrants to digital migration. Research from the UNESCO around e-diasporas has shown how migrants are connected through technology. And this shifts in a way the notion of people on the move and people who have moved from being uprooted and separated from their homes to highlighting their connected presence in diasporic settings through technologies. From kind of this research on e-diasporas, there's also been an increased research on that examines the everyday digitally mediated digital connectivities of migrants, that in the context of the so-called European refugee migration crisis of 2015 has given rise to an increase in the understanding of how migrants use technologies, not only to belong and connect, but also to survive. And this is something that Marie Gaudin and I wrote about in a book chapter. We have now come to what can be described or has been introduced by Leos and Nets as the new field of digital migration studies, which focuses on the roles of digital technologies in governmentality of migrants' movements and also in the everyday experiences of forced migrants and their uses of technologies. So we can see how over the last 30 years, migration has really become embedded with technology and digital formations. At the same time, the study of borders really has increased, creating its own field, interdisciplinary field of border studies. And that also can see a very interesting shift from an understanding of borders in terms of physical walls to something totally different in the digital age. And I'm now just briefly giving an overview of three kind of main keywords that have been used in the field of borders and border studies, whereby the concept of border, first of all, doesn't refer simply any longer to a wall around a nation state territory, even though we see that many physical walls are being built, so that needs to be kept in mind. But we can see borders as being constituted as a network, distributed network of myriad of checkpoints of technologies and actors, which are situated not only at the physical borders of nation states, but also inside and outside state territories. And therefore, borders are now being looked at as a processual, deterritorialized, and dispersed phenomenon. Within the kind of changing understanding of borders, we've also seen an increase in the focus on practices, bordering processes and bordering practices. And bordering processes and practices pretty much capture the everyday construction of borders that are not only enacted through, again, physical, real kind of material borders, but also through ideology, cultural mediation, discourses, and political institutions. So that, again, borders have now shifted from the margins, one could say, to the inner core of our daily life. And my colleagues at the University of East London, Nira Yuval Davis, Georgie Wemyss, and Cassidy, have written a very interesting book that looks at border and borderings, has everyday bordering practices that affect all the areas of our daily life, health, education, and so on, and make all of us becoming border guards and at the same time subject of border controls. So bordering practices have now pretty much are embedded in our everyday life. And we have, again, another addition to this understanding of borders, to the concept of borderscapes, that again expand the idea of borders from the physical to the practices to really an understanding of spatial and conceptual complexities and spaces of the border that is fluid and shifting. So that borders and these bordering kind of spaces in which bordering practices occur is a space that is traversed not only by bodies, but also discourses and relationships that redefine who is the inside and outside, who is a citizen, who is a non-citizen, host and guest, across state, regional, racial, and other symbolic boundaries, as Pereira writes. And in a way, to add to that, borders and borderscapes can be seen as conceptual tools that challenge state policies around the governmentality of borders, but also elements of political innovation through the reconceptualization and reframing of social, political, economic, and cultural spaces, Brambilla and colleagues write. So we can see that borderscapes have become a way of capturing all that is going on at the border, but that transcends the physicality of the borders. And in a way, the digital border then becomes an interesting component or an essential, one could say, element of borderscapes. And we have seen in many years how, in recent years, how information and communication technologies have increasingly played a crucial role in how states manage borders and how they govern migration. And we are witnessing what is becoming digital border governance, whereby categories and tools that are being used to categorize, to record the fingerprints of migrants, to enter data for migrants are becoming deterritorialized practices that categorize and manage control. Whereby in these kind of new forms of digital border governance, the human being, the body, becomes data, so that we see across Europe in particular, but in other settings as well, because there's this kind of imperial approach to technologies and what is called corporate sovereignty by Agamben. We can see how digital systems are deployed in processes of identification, collection, and categorization of the human body. And these kind of human bodies then become data in these large-scale digital databases that are being kept across the world. These digital borders are pretty much co-produced. So it's not just states that, in a way, govern through digital practices and create and recreate this kind of digital border space and digital governance processes, but they are actually the product of the interplay of human actors and technological systems at various border sites. And human actors include not only state actors, but also non-governmental organizations, as well as private companies. So that the smart border, as Vukov and Scheller have described, requires in a way the labor of a whole range of social actors, software developers, designers, engineers, infrastructure builders, as well as border guards and systems experts, and many others. But it also depends in a way on the labor of data-ready travelers who produce themselves at the border, and they give in a way this data in order to be able to access entry, protection, or recognition. And also the work of underground labor, as it is called, of those who are part of a new system of trafficking and smuggling in informal and illegalized economies that cross these borders. So there are politics of digital borders that need to be understood. And as we talk about the politics, I think it's very important, especially in the context of the Europe-Asia seminar series, to also think of how these new forms of digital governance, digital borders, digital migration, and so on, are reproducing certain processes of control that have been pretty much part of processes of colonialism in the past. So that we can see similarities with the systemic counting of bodies under colonial states in India, Africa, Southeast Asia, in the ways in which data has been produced and information flows have been created. So that similarly, we can see how the big data systems that are present nowadays that are used to categorize, organize, and segregate individuals into citizens and non-citizens resemble some of these old modalities of control and categorization. And they are, as we know from colonial, post-colonial studies, techniques that by measuring, normalize different and reproduce inequalities and hierarchies. We also see another similarity in the way in which current, digital governance and the use of digital technologies creates new systems of testing, so that the same way in which identity technologies and scientific methods were initially tested on colonized subjects before they were exported to the metropolis, in the current biometric system, we can see that they're initially trialed on those with fewer rights, the forced migrants, the undocumented migrants, the refugees, and so on, before they will spill over to the rest of the population. And we can also see similarities in the ways in which some of the media reproductions of those who use technologies reproduce, we go back to Edward Said's Orientalism, what Chung refers to high-tech, describes as high-tech Orientalism, in which the appearance of digitally connected refugees, such as Syrian refugees using mobile phones or texting home once they reach the shores of Europe, in a way is framed almost as being a surprise, as being incompatible with Eurocentric expectations of suffering and poor refugees, reproducing again Orientalistic assumptions. And we can also see how pretty much all these systems contribute to recreate, again, unequal power and hierarchical power relations that has been described by Gilroy in the Black Atlantic and by Di Maio in the Black Mediterranean, whereby the power wielded by politicians, police and military personnel over refugees determines their everyday experience. So taking digital practices, technology as an entry point, as if it was a neutral tool, runs the risk of reproducing neocolonial, techno-deterministic and decontextual celebrations of the place of technology as an agent of change that needs to be problematized. And what we, in a way, need to also think about, and I've moved from migration, digital migration, to borders, digital borderscapes and digital borders. We need, in a way, to also then problematize technology, not just as a neutral tool, but for its political role in the ways in which migration is being represented, managed, and controlled. So let me then come to the last kind of key point of the third keyword, which is technology, of my initial part of my presentation. So we know from Castell's work in 2004 that the whole world is a network society. And he describes it as a society where social structure is made up of networks powered by macroelectronic-based forms and communication technologies. So while some would argue that technology does the work faster and better, it can also be argued that it changes the nature of everyday life. And I've just given the examples in the ways in which it shapes state management of borders and governance, but also migrants' everyday lives, as I've identified. So in the context of Techno-Borderscapes, I also think that it's quite interesting to think of technologies as this kind of system that are highly mobile themselves. So in terms of mobility, there is human mobility, but there's also this kind of new digital mobility. So that mobile digital technologies that are systems, applications, and material objects that can easily be transported and transferred are pretty much pervading our daily lives and the daily lives of those who are displaced and forced to move. So that we are now seeing, again, the proliferation of social media, mobile applications, online maps, instant messages, translation websites, wire money transfer, cell phone charging stations, and Wi-Fi hotspots, and so on and so on. To the degree that Latner and Kieft in 2018 have described them as digital infrastructures for global movement. So if we think of, again, digital technologies as part of the everyday lives of not only migrants, but a whole range of social actors around them, Nedelcu and Soisuren have referred to this as the empowerment control nexus. So there's an interesting here kind of tension between these complex interactions, whereby at one level, digital technologies at borders for migrants can become emancipatory practices that enable migrants to find information, to access, to keep in contact with the family and so on and so on. But there are also constraints created by these technological tools. And digital technologies have this mediating role in processes of empowering surveillance and migration control. And in our kind of attempt at bringing together these three keywords: digital migration, digital governance security, and digital technologies, mobile ones. We have Marigo Doná, and I know that she's she was trying to join us today, may participate in the discussion maybe later. Maria and I tried to think around these connections and introduce this concept that we call Techno-Borderscapes. And we use Techno-Borderscapes as a lens to capture these different forms of social interactions and disruptions that are articulated through digital devices at the border. We draw this kind of keyword Techno-Borderscapes from Apadurai's work on Technoscapes, where he looks at global and fluid configuration of technology that both high and low mechanical and informational now moves around various kinds of boundaries. And the work of Rajaram and Grandi-War that describe borderscapes as spaces where meanings and identities are negotiated and established, and hegemonic notions of the nation and of what it is to be a citizen are shuffled around. And where borderscapes are also markers of belonging and places in constant state of becoming. So borderscapes and techno-borderscapes, we would like to suggest, are by nature transformative and transforming spaces. So techno-borderscapes help us to rethink the border as a site of online and offline encounters and disruptions among forced migrants and other social actors, activists, border guards, smugglers, and humanitarians, who also use mobile technologies at the border. It also helps us to examine how mobile digital devices are used to interact, negotiate, and interfere with, again, with these diverse agendas of various states and non-state actors. And in particular, through the entry point of migrants, but not necessarily staying with migrants, but looking at all these other actors. So Technoscapes is like a fluid scape. We can see that in a way, digital devices and tools like mobile phones shape migrants' experiences of the border, migrant trajectories, and their transnational encounters. So that migrants use mobile devices to bypass borders and also to create new forms of, and I will develop these concepts more in the second part of the presentation, what become new forms of refugee-to-refugee monitoring, protection, and assistance. So they become part of this space where digital securitization, humanitarianism operates, and they become actors in this space through the use of technologies with its, one could say, positive and negatives. So in a way, Techno-Borderscapes helps us to unravel the intersections among digital securitization, humanitarianism, and activism that permeate many border sites. And that often, when described in the literatures, render migrants sometimes as outsiders or objects of security, victims of humanitarian aid, or subjects with political agency in activism. But we show through the empirical case study later that they, in a way, resist and protect against surveillance and engage with and become humanitarian and activists. So key features of our concept Techno-Borderscapes are the following. So for us, it is a web of articulations that in a way move beyond the dichotomy of top-down digital infrastructures that are, again, constraining, and bottom-up refugees kind of uses of devices that are empowering, to consider a much greater fluidity and co-construction and correlational interactions in spaces. They can also not be understood only in the virtual realm, but also offline through their material, cultural, political, economic, and emotional dimensions. They are not neutral spaces, but sites of contestation. And in these spaces, we can see how hybridity, heterogeneity, and this complex character of the digitally mediated encounters unfold in multiple ways. So we can borrow from Ajay's idea of banal cosmopolitanism at the border to talk about a digital banal cosmopolitanism across borderscapes. And in a way, they also revealed intricate intertextual and interdiscursive relations between digital platforms, material spaces, and embodied politics. So having introduced the more kind of conceptual part, I now want to give a case study that is based on the ethnographic work that Marie Godin and I did in one of the border sites inside Europe, which is the Calais, the France-UK border in Calais. So what is interesting about this site, apart from the fact that it has become highly visible, is that in a way it recreates borderscapes at the heart of Europe, again repositioning the idea of borders at the peripheries to reposition, to move them inside at the core of Europe. And also, in a way, interesting relationships, colonial relationships between Britain and many of the migrants who are in Calais. So since the 90s, many migrants and refugees have been gathering in informal camps, and prior to its closure in 2016, around 2,000 individuals were living in what was called the Calais jungle, which is an interesting space because it is outside conventional forms of citizenship, protection, and assistance. And even though the camp was closed, the migrants are still reaching the border in Calais to try to move to the UK. So our research and the methodology of our research is part of a broader civic engagement project called Life Histories that a number of colleagues and students at the University of East London delivered to migrants in Calais. So it was an open access course that migrants could take even if they didn't have documentation. And it was what is called multimodal course. We used different types of narratives, visual, verbal, written, as well as participatory and ethnographic research in the transit site of Calais. And again, some of the migrants became actors and authors of their voice and produced a book called, you can see that on the right-hand side, Voices from the Jungle. There was also a photo project called Displaces, and so on and so on. So as part of this ongoing engagement with migrants in the transit border through what might be called activist, educational, and participatory research, we also conducted participant observations and life histories between 2015 and 2016. And because of the nature of this research, we have maintained ongoing collaborations with a subgroup of former residents of Calais who now live in the UK and France. And we are still in touch with a number of them. So that there is, again, this particular type of methodology, which is very much embedded in what may be called an activist educational project. I am now giving some examples of the ways in which, taken as a point of entry, migrants' experiences, they engage with a range of social actors. And I'm also introducing some of the voices from other social actors, but I want the entry point to be that of the migrants. So before I do that, I want to clarify that I'm going to look at only three examples, and there could be, or three themes. There could be more that I think need to be developed, but I'm looking at digital securitization, digital humanitarianism, and digital activism, and the ways in which they unfold in Techno-Borderscapes. So as I have already indicated, digital borders has resulted in a high level of securitized systems that in a way extend state controls over bounded territories and populations. And states have increased the use of technologies to manage cross-border migration, in the case of Calais, to securitize border areas with a wall and monitor the movement of people within nation states' borders. Examples of this digital securitization across Europe can be seen in some of the European surveillance systems, and that have in a way been not only developed, but have become quite dominant in discourses of border securitization. So for instance, we have Eurosur, which is the European border surveillance system that uses drone and satellite surveillance of the Mediterranean and reinforces these external borders through the classification of groups. But also we have more interested for those who have crossed the Mediterranean, those who have crossed the Aegean, those who have managed to enter Europe. We have Eurodac, which is a biometric information collection at the border that stores the fingerprints of asylum seekers and irregular migrants, thus reinforcing internal boundaries through the identification of individuals. So on the one hand, we have the externalization of the border and its use of technology to control borders. And on the other hand, we have other techniques that in a way follow, register, code, administer migrants and their data and follow them once they enter Europe. And we have new forms like risk profiling that is used as a type of digital governance that segregates illegitimate and legitimate mobilities so that people can move for leisure or business inside Europe, but other illegitimate mobilities such as terrorism or illegal migration, as they're described in EU documents, are being profiled and categorized. So it is in this kind of context of high securitization, digital securitization, that migrants use technologies to negotiate this space of and trying to create alternative forms of protection that is pretty much a peer-to-peer system of monitoring. And I'm giving a quote now from Mohammed, who explains his journey, before reaching Calais, and describes how he used, in a way, the mobile phone as a protection tool. And I quote, "We arrived in Greece on the island of Chios at 4:30 a.m. And because we got wet, my mobile phone was damaged and it was cold. The second day, I sent my group, as I had planned, before me on the ship from Chios to Kavala in Greece. I had to find an excuse not to go with them. They discovered I was not with them when they were on the ship. I was watching their progress step by step to make sure that they would arrive safely. That was my promise to my brother. When I was assured that they were safe, I started my journey." So we can see here how Mohammed is using, in these highly securitized and precarious spaces, Techno-Borderscapes, is using a mobile phone both as a way to ensure, monitor the safety and therefore act as a form of protection and peer monitoring. But also, as we found out in other interviews, this level of protection makes some of the migrants feel as if they are smugglers. They are the ones who are also involved in this kind of border crossing through this monitoring. So it has kind of this ambivalent connotation. For those who have reached Calais and are, again, as you can see from the picture on the right-hand side, positioned in a very, also not only border securitized, but micro level, ongoing surveillance, the mobile phone can be also used as some sort of form of, again, protection at the border itself in their daily lives, and a form of documentation of abuses. And again, I quote another testimony. Living in such an environment, having a mobile phone, it gives the possibility to let people whom you know, to let them know where you are. If something goes wrong with you, for instance, if you go to hospital, so people can check on you. In the jungle, there have been some fascist attacks. So if a fascist attacks you, I have more than 50 pictures on my phone. Trust me, more than 700 people have been to hospital because of fascist attacks. But not only that, I know that some people have been killed. So this testimony gives an example of the ways in which the mobile phones is used as a communication tool to pretty much not only share general information, but to protect oneself in these highly securitized borders, but also as a way to document what is going on in the future. And not only migrants, but also a whole range of other actors are part of these borderscapes, and in a way have to negotiate, digitally mediate this surveillance, digital surveillance. So for instance, there is, in Calais, we saw a notice posted on the door of a shop that has a recognizable blue rectangle with the word Facebook. And what the note says is, beware refugees and volunteers. So in a way brings these different actors together. The UK Home Office will look at your Facebook account and they will use photos of you in Calais or other European countries to try and deport you. Be very careful about who you add, your profile pictures, what pictures you are tagged in, who you tag, and your privacy settings. So we can see through this note how publicly this Techno-Borderscape of surveillance is being digitally mediated by people alerting one another that they need to develop strategies to overcome these transnational forms of control and surveillance. I'm moving on to the second example of digital humanitarianism and how it unfolds mediated by technologies in Calais. But again, first, let me start with a general kind of overview of what digital humanitarianism may mean both in Calais, but also more broadly at Borderscapes. So we have what Sandri has described as volunteer humanitarianism, which is heavily reliant on online social networking sites, highly flexible, spontaneous, and mobile networks, and online communities of solidarity. So most of those who went to Calais met, organized, and were delivering food by communicating through social media platforms. So this is one way in which this volunteer humanitarianism is heavily reliant on information and communication technologies. But we also see how this reliance on new technologies is also quite important for migrants themselves. So that the face of humanitarianism also changes, because now refugees and those people on the move not only need food, shelter, and protection, but also access to electricity and Wi-Fi, services that would have been an afterthought only a few years ago. So digital humanitarianism and the use of technology is being promoted as a way to deliver aid more efficiently, but it also become an emergency technological service. So for those who were crossing the Mediterranean, for instance, these mobile phones that people could call as an SOS and in order to be rescued is another kind of transition in digital humanitarianism. And technology has almost become a form of aid provision by itself. And I'm going to give all ways to deliver aid as a basis on the foundation of which aid and humanitarianism can be delivered. So I'll give you some examples. So for instance, starting from Calais, we have this platform called Phone Credit for Refugees and Displaced People. And you can see the photo on the right-hand side, whereby using online platforms, what is provided as aid to refugees is pretty much money, data to make phone calls, or a SIM card, and so on and so on. And all of this is organized with over 64,000 members through top-ups. And according to their website, they have completed more than 30,000 top-ups and have raised over £500,000, which now has become even higher. So we can see how all kind of technology, this digital humanitarianism is changing, not only as a mode of delivery, but also as a type of aid that is being provided. But also more broadly, across borderscapes in the world, technologies are being used more and more frequently, so that the World Food Programs has smart cards that allows refugees in camps not to receive food, but to buy goods and participate in supermarkets. Or UNHCR use ATM cards to withdraw money instead of giving physical goods to asylums to refugees. And Iris Guard is an eye documentation scanner that allows individuals to go to a cash machine and scan their eye and get cash entitlements. We can see how, again, technology is being used in these settings. And one of the, one could say, global ways is actually being implemented by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which has set up since 2004 the Progress database, which is a digital record for every refugee that contains their personal details, contact information, place of origin, time of arrival, education, occupation, family members, and other details. And this database has been implemented in over 70 countries, so that people who apply for protection and those who want to receive aid from UNHCR and its partners are registered into this global database. As you can see then, there is a tension that is emerging in the use of digital technologies, which on the other hand are enhancing care, but also play a role in the control of migration. And this is what Lyon refers to as the continuum between care and control, where Lyon writes, technologies of control become humanitarianized and couched within a rhetoric of care that in turn imbues them with a humane value and gives them normative and scientific validation. So that while one can say that smartphones have played a crucial role in helping refugees to stay safe, to gather life-saving information, to receive aid, they also risk turning into surveillance tools that enable governments and other entities to strengthen their control of refugees' movements and identities. And Agamben describes these new biometric forms of surveillance as biopolitical tattooing, which is in a way a progressive animalization of man, I would say datazation of man that is enabled through these sophisticated techniques. And again, Agamben again would say that some humanitarian organizations, in spite of themselves, in spite of having care ambitions, maintain a secret solidarity with the very powers they ought to fight, insofar as they can only grasp human life through the gaze of a bare life and the data that, in a way, refugees produce in the attempt to receive humanitarian aid, so that in certain conditions, if you're not registered through these forms, whether it's a scanner or fingerprints and so on, you cannot receive aid. It becomes a conditional form of digital aid. So in this kind of new landscape of digital humanitarianism, how do migrants and refugees who were in Calais negotiated through the use of technologies? Again, it's kind of ambivalent, but we could also see that they use technologies to become embedded in this landscape of digital humanitarianism. And I give a couple of examples. So for instance, Abdul from Afghanistan, when we were conversing with him on one occasion, told us that he had already been in the UK as a student, had been deported, he knew the system and so on and so on. And therefore he became part of this humanitarian community, so to speak. And he, during our conversations, he was called many times by phone to interpret for connationals that didn't speak English and needed to be registered with French authorities. So he was becoming the digital intermediary and also the cultural intermediary in this humanitarian landscape. Other refugees have realized that many people who are involved in digital humanitarianism can also involve them more. But when they don't, they themselves can become humanitarians in providing peer humanitarianism. And another example is the Facebook page called Refugee Voices 2015, which was set up by a refugee who gave himself the pseudonym Refugee's Voice when he was in the Calais camp. And the aim of that Facebook page was to provide humanitarian assistance to residents, but also not only to help them in the camp, but to travel safely to the UK. And again, this is a quote that has been taken, a testimony from him, where he says, "To be honest, I saw a lot of volunteers who are helping refugees, and I was also one of them. I was a refugee volunteer. I realized that I see many things being done from the volunteer's perspective, but what would I do from a refugee perspective? I saw many social media pages on Facebook, and this is the time I realized I needed to do something." And he set up this, again, Facebook page. After giving some examples of how digital humanitarianism unfolds in borderscapes and techno-borderscapes, I just want to move on to the last thematic example, which is around digital activism, which again, given the borders are highly contested, many activists participate in these spaces. So digital activism in general has been, is a way to, according to Siapera, to hack or bring change to the representational battlefield of the mediation of difference. And we have what Constanza Choc refers to activists tactics. And they may include example like citizen witnessing what goes on in borderscapes, advocating for open or no borders, using personal storytelling as ways to enact change, like in the case of Alan Kurdi, vigilante organizations in the US using technology to coordinate citizen organized food patrols to locate and assist migrants in danger, and so on and so on. And pretty much digital activism or activist tactics challenge stigmatizing perceptions of asylum as a security threat and advocate for migrants' right to cross borders as global citizens. So in this space of digital activism, again, migrants and refugees, who we should remember are politically active in their home countries, so bring with them a whole range of cultural and social capital and commitment to improving not only their lives, but those of their countrymen, are in Calais pretty much part of this digital activism landscape. So they, as you can see from the photo on the right-hand side, one of them bear witness to the violence that took place in the destruction of the Calais camp, problematize the borders. So we have what examples of what is called, and I put border resistance. So some of the migrants who were part of the Displaces photo project documented the violence of the border through performative photography. They also organize and use social media to advocate for change, as Mohammed from Afghanistan says, and I quote, "We as the community representatives even wrote a letter for David Cameron, and in this letter we were suggesting a better method for refugees." So they're using social media to gain information, to promote change, and then to act also directly through conventional, one could say, political representation and expression of their voices, again, showing the interaction between the online and offline modalities of activism. Having said that, we also need to, in a way, think of Techno-Borderscapes as sites where migrants in transit spend not only days, but sometimes weeks, months. And we met somebody who had spent years trying to cross and unable to do so. So in this context, one could say that we witness what might be seen Techno-Borderscapes sociabilities, as the example of Calais, who is from Afghanistan and owned a restaurant called Kurosan on the main street of the Calais refugee camp, describes. And he took this picture as part of the Displaces photo project. And then he describes how through the charging of mobile phones, which we also witness, there is a creation of new types of banal cosmopolitanism or digital banal cosmopolitanism, as we might call it. And I quote again from Kalim. "It was a rainy day. I was sitting inside my restaurant. It is a little bit shady, and that is because of the mirror. I was sitting inside, so that is why it is a little bit shady. I think this place is important for people because lots of people are coming here, charging their mobile phones, getting together, discuss with each other, and get food and drinks as well. People are from different communities. Iraqis, Syrian, Eritrean, Sudanese, Pakistani, Afghani people come here, all mixed together." So again, this also gives us a different take on border spaces as spaces in between, or spaces where empty spaces of people trying to cross, where again, through technologies and resistance and activism and so on, migrants create sociabilities and interactions. This, however, doesn't come without certain costs. And I want to come to the end of my description of fieldwork by also examining the emergence, something that needs to be studied, I think, in much greater depth, of digital inequalities. Because we saw in the refugee camp that there were gender differences and generational gaps, and also national inequalities with, let's say, young Syrian men having much greater access to digital equalities compared to Somali or Eritrean women, or an older Iraqi man whom we met. So again, another example of the ways in which these digital inequalities play out and are kind of dynamic is the example from Shaheen from Afghanistan, who lost his mobile phone. And then he said, then I asked someone to lend me a mobile, and I called my agent. I told him that I was in Serbia. He said, stay with the person with the phone. I'm sending someone to fetch you. After 20 minutes, someone called and asked my name. Again, we can see here this other interesting interaction with the smugglers and the agents, as they're called, and how mobile technologies that smugglers use to promote trips to Italy or to engage with monitoring the movement are also playing out in this landscape, Techno-Borderscape. So after Calais, we have kept in touch with a whole range of migrants whom we met. And to conclude, I want to give some examples of the ways in which technologies allow some sort of continuity around the experience of Calais through the use of technology. So I'm giving the example of Hope Towns, which is a refugee community organization set up by two individuals, somebody who gives himself the pseudonym Africa, who is from Sudan, and Mohammed from Afghanistan. So after reaching the UK, they set up Hope Towns with the aim to support refugees who were still in Calais by facilitating connections between volunteers in the UK and transit migrants at the border in France. And with the closure of the so-called Calais jungle, Hope Towns focused its efforts of refugees in the UK, including those who had transited in Calais. And I want again to give a quote from the Hope Towns website, which shows this connection that are present and the legacy of Calais that is maintained through in Techno-Borderscapes. So hello everyone, to all Calais family. A wonderful Sudanese man, well-known ex-jungle resident, who now has his papers and lives in London, was savagely attacked 6 months ago by a racist gang, putting him in the hospital for over 2 months. He is in dire need of support, but especially of help from someone who knows how to navigate British social paperwork and can fight for his rights, get him council housing. Can any of you help or know who he can contact that would help him out? So this kind of call for help to volunteers, migrants, anybody who can help is an interesting example of the ways in which these everyday bordering practices and Techno-Borderscapes also transcend the physical border, because we can see here how we are encountering what my colleagues would describe as everyday bordering practices in the area of health, social care, and so on, once migrants reach their destination. So to conclude, I hope that I have given you a conceptual and empirical understanding of the ways in which Techno-Borderscapes can be understood or can be used can be adapted as a useful concept, and it has relevance as a lens to rethink the relationship between migration, borders, and technologies with which I started. And what I think is interesting for us to think from the entry point to migrants in relation to all these other social actors is the ways in which mobile technologies help us to rethink and reposition their roles in Techno-Borderscapes, where we see new forms of refugee-to-refugee protection. We can see transnational monitoring. We can see assistance, that is peer-to-peer assistance. That is not often well documented when people describe humanitarianism, activism, and so on, as if migrants are the object but not the actors in these spaces. And the idea of Techno-Borderscapes aims to, again, highlight these interconnections and fluid encounters. And I want to then conclude the presentation by reflecting together on where I think this type of concept might be pursued further. And from where I stand, I think that if I were to do further research, and this is a call for collaborations and research ideas, is that I think that this idea of Techno-Borderscapes should be, in a way, looked at in relation to other physical geographical spaces across the world. Because again, looking at Europe, we want to decenter Europe, as I said at the beginning. But also I think that it's interesting for us to reflect more in a more focused ways on how Techno-Borderscapes produce or reproduce or challenge post and decolonial understandings of the movement of people and their position in these new hierarchies of power that are globalized. And then lastly, I think that even though we did, in a way, try to speak to humanitarians and other actors, I think that there is something useful to reflect upon. And I'm borrowing this again from the work of my colleagues, Nida Yuval-Davis and Giorgia Wemis, on the ways in which intersectional situated methodologies can help us to understand the positions of these different actors and their uses of technologies and their interactions across Techno-Borderscapes, so that in a more systematic way, we could have, or I would like to, if I were to do a similar project in a different context, look at also interview more systematically other actors, and that with the challenges would include agents, would include also residents of these borderscape areas, which are not part in my presentation of this particular work, even though I did speak with some of them informally. So this is the end of my presentation. I am including for you the references to the two articles that Marie Godet and I wrote, the two pieces that Marie Godet and I wrote on Techno-Borderscapes. And although you cannot see the link, we have 50 copies of the Rethinking Transit Zones, Migrant Trajectories and Transnational Networks in Techno-Borderscapes that are freely available. So you can email myself or Maria, and you can see the email addresses at the end if you want to receive a copy of the paper. And then there's also information of a book that is here in which we have another chapter on the same topic. And with this, I'm going to conclude and thank you for listening. And I'm aware that I have pretty much gone over my time, so to speak, or more or less my time. So I had a short video to show, but I think I will leave that maybe if we have time after the presentation. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Giorgia. As I said, that when we were starting the series, that we knew, maybe we did not know what all of the speakers that we would like to invite, but we knew that with whom that we wanted to start, as I said, and actually we were very right about that. And when we were envisioning those series, then we said that we wanted to really tackle the questions about the changing and the complexities of bordering regimes, which are very much at the heart of all forced migration studies or thinking through the forced migration, because it has repercussions beyond the only about it's beyond the forced migrants, beyond the migrants, and then the refugees, because also it gives us hints about thinking about solidarity networks, about activism, but also in terms of the complex phases of the technologies and the digitalization. And thank you very much for excellent talk in terms of complicating and showing the very different facets of what you called under the Techno-Borderscapes. And what I also see in a very interesting way, that you actually lay out the kind of a field in terms of where you have the digital securitization, digital humanitarianism, digital activism, and which is very much embedded within very unequal and power hierarchies, but nevertheless, it provides a kind of a possibility of creating a resistance, negotiations, and creating of voices. And but in a way, you had also shown that how within those kind of even the voices, negotiations, that the blurring of the boundaries of that the actors, that you could become intermediary, that with the refugees, or you could become as a kind of a smuggler. Put it in that. So there is no easy way out of capturing those complexities. We have several questions already lined up. So I would give the floor. I will read these questions. That in what ways do you think, this is from Vaishal, in what ways do you think the digital humanitarianism works in creating identities of those people that we call migrant and refugees? And I think that also goes to the question about blurring the boundaries of that, these subjectivities, where the subjectivities are called truth, but also very kind of a blurred boundaries. And second question from the same participant, when we speak about forced migrants, refugees, and violence, what are the ways in which the digital creates the identity of migrant refugee women around the narrative of sexual and gender-based violence? So I think these are very interrelated questions. This is the first one that I would like to pose from the audience.
Okay, thank you very much for the questions, which are really pertinent and again help me and Marie with our thinking. So in relation to the first one, what is, how do, in a way, migrants and refugees identities are shaped in this digital humanitarianism landscape? As I said, we have multiple identities all the time, and these are contextually dependent. So in one occasion, somebody may be, a political activist, in another, somebody may be an artist, and so on and so on. So the fact that in the context of, let's say, Calais, they were in a position to be seen as people on the move, didn't mean that from their perspective, they saw themselves under this, what Roger Zetter refers as the refugee label, because they had ongoing multiple identities, and in relation to helping one another. That was quite, that is something that not all of them did, but many of them took advantage of the fact that there were humanitarians on the ground to actually engage with them. So there was like a small library where migrants were volunteering in the giving food and so on and so on. So I think that in the space, in this transit space, also migrants want to exercise agency, and becoming a humanitarian is one of these ways. Additionally, in terms of identity, the framing of identities at the border is often quite negative. The terrorist threat, and so on and so on, or the one could say the paternalistic one, the victim, the one in need. And I think that by becoming humanitarians, the migrants would actually reclaim some of their positive identities that they still had with them, so that they weren't just people in need, but they were also people who helped. They weren't just perceived as the criminals or the victims of those who wanted to cross, but they were also those who were, being, good citizens by helping others. So I think it did shape identities in a whole range of ways that again showed that the fluidity really of these spaces where we enact who we are. We also, and I'm taking a slight tangent here, but we also, when Marie in particular did the Displaces project with the photographer Crispin Hughes, where cameras were given to them to take pictures of the camp, it was very interesting how many of them, like one of them had a suit in the tent, so that because he was an engineer in his own country. So people are always trying to renegotiate their identities, and being a humanitarian is one of them, or being an activist is one of them. Then in relation to gender, I think that is a very interesting question. That is another question that I like to, actually, maybe I should add a very good point to the future research, because we did speak to some women in Calais, but it's interesting because they were actually located in a separate area. There was a separate area for women and children, which was highly securitized for their protection. So they could go in and could come out of that particular section of the camp, of the settlement, of the area. And the reason behind it was, in a way, which again I find it ambivalent, was to protect them from sexual violence, that all the men were outside the protected space could enact on them. And while it is true that many women, and we know that, who cross the multiple borders as undocumented migrants are subjected to sexual violence and gender violence, it is interesting that the ways in which it was constructed was to protect from the men in the camp, as opposed to maybe politicized, gender violence as a broader issue, or as a way maybe to have rights, to claim asylum more directly, and so on and so on. So it's a very good point. Thank you for that.
Okay, we have another one about race and racialization, and wonder whether Giorgia could talk a little bit about the ways in which race and racialization and perhaps racism shape borders in the digital age. Would be good to hear of any evidence from your interviews, if there's any.
So that's, again, I need to think a bit about the Calais site in terms of race and racialization. Definitely, I think that there were, based on my interviews, but also on follow-up interviews with migrants who are now in the UK, there were definitely racialized tensions among, there are different levels of, I suppose, racialized interactions. So clearly the one with the police and the migrants could be seen as a very clear, white, non-white, citizen, non-citizen racialized interactions. There were also other ones from the inhabitants of the area who felt that, again, the migrants were overwhelming, creating tensions. So, and there was this kind of, some of these representations of the migrants as threat, as dangerous, as, creating problems, and so on, were in a way examples that reflected lived realities, which we must acknowledge, but often myths around the construction of the other as danger. So this would be forms of racialized kind of perceptions and representations. But there were other ones also inside the camp among different groups of migrants. And this could be also seen in the ways in which the economies of smuggling were operating, whereby there were different prices for the crossing according to which nation you belonged to. But there were also different points of crossing. So if you were from Syria, you would be asked to pay by the smuggler. So there is this other kind of form of racialized economies, if we want to call them like that, whereby the value of one's ethnicity or one's nationality plays out in the mobility. So that if you were of a certain country, if you were a Syrian, for instance, you would be paying more to cross in Calais. If you were from Eritrea, you would be paying less, but you were sent to cross further north with smaller boats and paying less. So there were all these other types. And then to, again, to add another ones in terms of technologies, as I pointed out, the access to the internet. So there were in Calais different hotspots. So there was a digital infrastructure, because you can't have mobile phones unless you have places where you can charge, but also access to Wi-Fi. So there were Wi-Fi spots and so on and so on. And we did notice that on one occasion when we were in the young kind of place where young people were congregating, there was a tension in accessing the chargers between different kind of groups of young people from different countries. And again, whether that can be framed as racialized or in a way violence due to a scarcity of resources is something that may need to be explored more in depth. But definitely there were these kind of stereotypes that were reproduced around and are reproduced in Europe, in the eyes of Europe, or who are the the better migrants and the less deserving migrants at the border, both from, again, the outside and inside. But again, that's a question that I'm going to take with me, because it's a very good one.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Sabaya Sachi from Calcutta Research Group. Don't you find any problem with digital humanitarianism in this age of surveillance capitalism? I think it's also one.
Yes, okay. So for those of you who are part of the, Europe, Calcutta India network, we also know that we're working on the Global Compact on refugees and migration. And some of my interventions are around this whole idea of the, in a way, the entrance in such a welcome way of private companies and the private sector into the provision of humanitarian aid, which in my mind undermines some of the commonings that should be part of the public sphere, that is the protection and support of migrants and solidarity. So given that, it then follows that my answer to your question is that I am indeed very concerned about the ways in which, so unproblematically, big organizations as well as small organizations are embracing these kind of technological tools of surveillance as if they were neutral tools that help them to deliver, like almost utilitarian ways. They help to deliver aid better, so why not use them? Without realizing that the repercussions in the long term could be quite dangerous for those who are in a vulnerable situation. So yes, I'm very, very concerned about this. And I think that is, again, something that some scholars have begun to unpack, and some scholars have criticized digital humanitarianism. But I think it needs to be pushed much, much further, really.
Okay. Thank you very much. And actually, I thought that is in your talk, that by showing, not only hinting at, but explicitly referring to the dark side of those technologies and their politics, that there was a kind of a warning implicit in the surveillance capitalism. But I think that the digital humanitarianism makes it very concrete, a very contested concept, actually, in relation to that. We have another question from the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology, Monika Palmberger. Thanking for your wonderful talk. I would like to ask you to historically contextualize digital humanitarianism and digital activism. What makes it, in your understanding, different from, so to speak, pre-digital humanitarianism and activism? Have they become a more participatory engagement? Participatory in quotation marks.
I think that there are some continuities, but I can see also a number of divergences, or convergences and divergences. in this pre and post, or in the continuity, maybe in the shift between pre-digital humanitarianism and I'll stick with humanitarianism first. So the examples I just gave of the ways in which all NGOs are in a way recording data of migrants to provide services, for me, marks a shift in the ways in which humanitarianism was present or not. Now, it marks a shift, but it also marks continuities, because as I said at the beginning, the census of refugees in camps is nothing new. Yeah, we've always had that. Yeah, in a way, the controlling or the monitoring and so on in order to provide assistance has been part of humanitarian practice. But what I think is changing now is that we don't know what happens to that data once it's being collected, because it really goes out of the control. It's so, and with these high-tech companies really being embedded in the humanitarian landscape, I think that they will have control on this data, so they can use it, one could say, for marketing purposes, so that we will find out which refugees women need what at what point in a camp, and then they can be delivered that type of aid. But they can also be used to what is called to predict future behaviors, to monitor those who may express their political voice. So we don't know how these databases have been used. And I think the whole issue of big data, which pervades the world, the globe as a whole, is something that in a way has entered humanitarianism in a somewhat, not only a problematic way, but it's been welcomed, like as if innovative. So if you look at some of the readings on Zaatari camps or some of the other camps for Syrian refugees in Jordan, you would say how these innovative technologies are really helping refugees and so on and so on. And I'm not in a way saying that they're not. What I'm saying is that we need to, in a way, to also look at what they do and how we can maybe plan safeguarding tools to ensure that those who are in Zaatari, the Syrians in camps in Jordan, whose fingerprints and eyes, pupil iris is being detected, and then they want to move on somewhere else and so on and so on. We don't know what's going to happen to that information once they reach the borders of Europe or once they go back to Syria. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. And in terms of activism, again, probably some of the arguments would apply to activism as well, but I want to add an additional element to the hacking in the activism, which I found quite interesting. And I read a couple of articles to prepare for this presentation, in which many, in a way, I suppose, hackers and those who know about how to manage computers and data and so on in a way which I'm not familiar with, are now in a way creating a different, are entering this debate of the digital from a much more, one could say, conscious position, where with an awareness that in a way data that is being collected can be used against people who are vulnerable. And therefore, because we are the high-tech companies, because of the ways in which governments or corporate governability is now shaping the world we live in, they are very much aware. So in a way, they are engaging in dialogue with these new platforms. So I think that activism has been there. Again, the aim is the same. In the same way in which, again, I want to say humanitarianism, the aim is good. It's just that maybe we need to problematize some of these tools a bit more. And similarly with activism, I think that they are a bit further ahead than humanitarians in this respect, because they're already very much aware of the dangers that data has in terms of the politics of data.
Okay, thank you very much. We just hope that the digital humanitarianism will catch up with the activism, or maybe it is in their nature that there would be some kind of boundedness or hindering them to move that kind of a more reflexive mode of the use of digital technologies. We had questions about from the cross-cutting through gender and bringing the gender issue, the peculiarities, and then the race. Of course, there we have a question which follows very much with that in terms of age and generations. Someone is so asking, I would like to know, what are the differences with technology use in regards to age, specifically older adults, immigrants? I mean, I think the refugees and then the forced migrants. How do you see that, the generational differences?
Yes, I thought there was going to be class. Age is good too. We'll get to classes, but I thought you were going to talk. But before I answer this question, can I also point out that I'm just, because I'm also, in terms of digital humanitarianism, if you just bear with me a second, I'm also involved in two other very interesting projects at the moment with some of my current and former students. And one is to try and understand how a whole range of non-governmental organizations, because of COVID, have moved their provision of legal educational support to, in this case, like young migrants in the UK online. Because that is something that is, there was no alternative, so to speak. So the provision of, whether it's humanitarian aid or other types of support to young people, with COVID, I think, has also, in a way, changed. There's almost no alternative now but to operate in certain places online, with some advantages and some disadvantages that we are exploring at the moment. And also another project that looks at the use of apps. So, as part of this new kind of digital humanitarianism, many organizations across Europe had set up applications to help migrants to get information as they were moving around. And even in that case, we're trying with the student who might be in this call, and may say a bit more if she feels like, around this idea across Europe. How do young people, because we're talking about age, so before I get to the elder, let me get to the young. So how do young people who are, one could say, more digitally inclined, are using applications to become more more agentic in their movements and to have greater control of the information that they get? So that's again something with this ambivalence, advantages and disadvantages, that I think would be interesting to explore. That also in a way looks at different types of borderscapes. But now getting to the elderly and age. So definitely for many of us, and I include myself in the world who don't belong to the digital generation, managing all this emerging set of digital tools is challenging. For those who come from countries where digital technologies are in a way also class related or cosmopolitan tools, that's another kind of type of inequality or barrier. And this kind of combines in the process of migration. And I want to give an example of this elderly Iraqi man whom we met in Calais, who was unable, was stuck in Calais. It was so heartening to see his situation, because he couldn't go back, he had no money, he couldn't cross. He was trying to stay in France, but couldn't stay in France, so was trying to find a wife, somebody who would marry him to be able to stay in France. So these are the strategies you try to enact when you're stuck. And he wasn't able to. And he had this kind of old mobile phone. And he couldn't buy a new one, but he had limited data memory on this one. So he couldn't make all these phone calls or access technologies in the ways in which other, migrants at the border could. And then was also, we witnessed an encounter with a humanitarian who was in a way going to his tent to help him to try and see if he could get extra memory onto his phone. So there is this example that I give is an example of the ways in which access to the economic access to technology is one issue. Digital literacy may be another one, but also the ways in which, again, in these Techno-Borderscapes, unless you have these technologies, your also chances of getting information and moving could be limited. So it's, age is also important. And again, with women, most of the women we spoke to were young women, but they also tended to have older candy bar style phones as opposed to smartphones.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, actually, the class question did not come, but actually it was part of it in terms of it's the exclusionary moment of digital technologies and its politics, and very much related in terms of whom does it enable to become more agentic, and who remains excluded even at that level. And I think that not only the generation that you show that very much also entangles with the class issue, with the digital literacies too. Of course, that I mean the young have very different capacities, and then I mean, like you, without help of Anna and Clemens, I don't think that I would have ever managed this one. The last question I would like to take is from Sabayasachi, and he wants to ask that he's asking, however, isn't there a risk of techno-colonialism in digital practices and in the humanitarian response to refugee and migration crisis? I think this is also a very substantial question.
Yes, it's again a very important question that I think would be an area I like to research further, because I do see that somebody even referred to colonial algorithms in the ways in which, again, the transformation of human beings into data through algorithms may affect what they receive in terms of aid, or what they may not receive, or when they receive it, or what they do it. So yes, again, going back to I suppose the literature that criticizes humanitarianism in general as part of the old modality of provision of assistance. And the Calais site in a way is interesting because many humanitarians were also solidarians. So they were there, not from the point of view of giving from a higher position, but from a point of view of solidarity to try and create a less unequal relationship. So that in a way, this Techno-Borderscapes became highly politicized and contested in that regard. So while in Calais, there were elements of, how can I put it, elements that challenge the conventional idea of humanitarianism, I think that in the other examples I gave, especially those of big organizations like the UNHCR database, the use of, again, all these new technologies to provide money and aid and protection to migrants, there could be, again, could be an example of techno-colonialism, because as we also know, and again, going back to the broader scheme of things, most technology corporations are located in the global north, and therefore the data that they get and what the data that they extract. So there is a form of extraction in the collection of this data. And what is interesting is also that some of these corporations, and again, it would be interesting to know the reasons behind it, because some of them may actually have very honorable motivations. But again, we need to understand what the impact might be. Some of them are volunteering to set up, through technology, new forms of aid, or there is something called tech refugees, where all these tech companies get together to provide support to refugees. So there is all of this kind of corporate social responsibility that is undergoing, and it would be interesting to explore more in depth whether it is techno-colonialism or whether it is something else.
Okay, thank you very much. I think actually the last question, and then where you also finished your presentation about the kind of the future prospects, future possibilities, research as that, and how do borderscapes and techno-borders challenge the post or decolonial perspectives. And actually, this is very much where the uses and the challenges to that, and where that our research platform is very much anchored, and that the last question took us very much into that too. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk, Giorgia, and thank you very much for your participation and for your questions. I would like to make two announcements and then to finish. One is that this is recorded, that the talk is recorded and will be circulated on Seminar Series page. The talk, and the second talk that our second in the seminar series talk will be by Jennifer Hindman on December 16th, and that will start 5:30 instead of 5 o'clock from again the Central European time. So we just hope that you will be able to join us to continue these conversations, and please join me to thanking to Giorgia, Doná once more for this wonderful talk, and to Clemens, Anna as personal help, but also IWM and the Department of Social and Cultural Anthropology for facilitating our and supporting our research platform with IWM and Calcutta Research Group. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, bye. Have a nice evening. Thank you.
Bye.